I'm honored and delighted to kick off the 20th anniversary of the KNI celebration with tonight's Fireside Chat. We're grateful to the Kavli Foundation and to the multitude of people who worked tirelessly to make it possible for us to host this special event on our campus. I'm Julia Greer, the Faculty Director of the Kavli Nanoscience Institute, and it is my pleasure to now introduce the President of Caltech, Sonia and William Davidow Professor of Physics, Tom Rosenbaum, who is going to introduce our special guest and to lead the discussion tonight. And with that, thank you and welcome to KNI20.
Well, welcome. Let me add my welcome in addition, and thank you, George, for joining us. I'm going to briefly introduce Professor Whitesides, and then we'll have a back and forth, a bit of a conversation, and then I have some questions submitted by members of the audience. So George M. Whitesides is the Woodford L. and Ann A. Flowers University Research Professor at Harvard University. Through more than 1,000 published papers, he has pioneered the fields of NMR spectroscopy, organometallic chemistry, soft lithography, self-assembly, microfabrication, microfluidics, soft robotics, and nanotechnology. Most recently, he is exploring the chemical origins of life. George is the recipient of numerous awards, including the National Medal of Science in 1998, the Kyoto Prize, the Welch Award in Chemistry, the Linus Pauling Award, the Priestley Medal, and the Kavli Prize in 2022, just a couple of years ago. What these awards do not fully capture is George's profound influence on how we frame and think about important problems, how we set intellectual directions in not only chemistry, but in science and engineering more generally, how engineering insights can be best channeled to change the world. There's no ambiguity about the positions George espouses, but they are always leavened by a generosity and a commitment to helping colleagues. I can offer a small vignette when, as provost at the University of Chicago, we were trying to establish engineering, an institution at Chicago so fully committed to pure science that it risked diminishing its impact in the world by ignoring the engineering disciplines. When I called George to help us think through this transition, he not only readily agreed to help, but jumped on a plane to Chicago with Bob Langer from MIT to lend his wisdom and enthusiasm. George's gimlet-eyed view of the pitfalls and possibilities, and he was very frank on both, which was enormously helpful, helped birth what is now a thriving Institute of Molecular Engineering at UChicago. Just one of many examples, George, of how you have shaped the future. So before going to the future, though, I thought I'd go back a little bit and ask you about growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, or outside Louisville, Kentucky. Your father was a chemical engineer, and when you were in high school at the Phillips Academy, you spent time working in your father's company, which specialized in polymers. Did you know then that you wanted to be a chemist and a molecular engineer?
Before I start in a long-winded exposition on the subject, should I be sitting here or should I be standing there?
You should be sitting there and
Okay.
relaxed.
Relaxed I am because you can't really, what can you do, sue me? I mean, so
No, we've released all legal liability.
My father was a chemical engineer, and he had an approach to science which consisted of looking at a problem that it was not solved, and then buying organic chemicals which were cheap because this was the time that the chemical industry was exploding. They'd discovered catalysis and were marching ahead making large quantities of pretty pure stuff at very low costs. And the polymer industry arose from that, and the current strength of chemistry as a component of the economy came from that period. And so his idea was to buy the cheapest things that he could find that were amines and that were epoxides or diapoxides, mix them up. He'd get some sort of glop out of that, which he would cure into a solid. And then he would determine whether that was useful or not. Did it solve a problem or did it not solve a problem? And if it did, he would then make large quantities of it. And if it didn't, then he would just drop that all and go into something else. But his approach to things was modified by simplicity, that is, the raw materials had to be available, cost, because that's the key component of everything that goes on in the real world, and then the basic idea of, can you make some sort of smart guess as to what you should put together with what in order to solve a particular problem. It was a very successful approach.
So you've talked about simplicity in different contexts and that being a key to your research. Did you appreciate that at the time with your father?
What I appreciated was not simplicity as a philosophical concept, but rather that it was a lot easier for someone to try something we had done to see if it worked for them, and they should do some more work to make it work even better than the other way around. So simplicity is not a method of doing things, it's a method of removing barriers, and it does that very well.
I see. And you've adapted that as an approach in your own research?
Absolutely. We try, one component of what we try is to make the methods simple enough that someone who has not done them before can try them to see if they work without going to a lot of effort. And the answer is they're a lot more likely to try it if it's not hard to do.
Right. And can you talk a little bit about that process? So making things simple may sound simple, but it's not, of course. So how do you get from not knowing where you're going, if you will, or experimenting, and then winnowing down into a process which you can explain?
But you know how much salt you put on the pork chops in order to make them taste good, right? It doesn't require a lot of thought. You just try it and you see. And that's the component with a lot of the research that you do. You do it, and if it's simple to do, then the members of the group will pick it up. And if the members of the group will pick it up, then others beyond that will pick it up, and it becomes self-sustaining.
I see. Very good. So I wanted to move on from Louisville to Caltech. And when you got here at Caltech, I understand that most of the research groups were full at that time, and you asked for a desk with Jack Roberts' group. And the rest is history, as they say, of course. And can you tell us about that experience and about your thesis work and your impressions here?
The rest of everything is history, right?
Well, indeed, but I was thinking of a specific life of accomplishment.
Well, I should say the story really started a little bit earlier. I originally applied to Caltech to be a graduate student, and I never got an answer. And then I applied to Berkeley to be a graduate student, and I never got an answer. And both of these places were chosen on the grounds that California is actually quite different than Massachusetts, and I wanted to try a different part of the United States. So at some point, it was the middle of August, and time was running out, and I wrote to Caltech and said, look, I'm a graduate student without a place to go, and I have a fellowship, and I'm not going to be expensive. Can I come to your place? And I will say that the second time around, Caltech answered. It was very kind of you. Thank goodness. Yeah. And it's, as we say, the rest is history. But what came from there is that I wandered from research group to research group saying basically, you know, I'm a graduate student. Do you have a place for me, please? Do you have a place for me? And the answer was typically, we'll get back to you, which of course we've all heard in various ways and can interpret in various ways. And eventually I was working with Jack Roberts, Professor J.D. Roberts, offered a suggestion, which was that he would allow me to use half of a research laboratory or half of a research bench for a time until I could find something more stable, which I did, until on one occasion a strange woman walked through the laboratory. Her name was Marjorie Casario, and she was handing something out. And I said, I shouldn't get one of these sheets of whatever it was because I'm not a graduate student. And in this group, and she said, as far as I'm concerned, you've got a bench here, you're doing research here, you're a graduate student here, take it and shut up. And that was what happened. So I became a graduate student at Caltech, in essence, by virtue of Marjorie Casario.
I see.
And an absence of positive executive experience by anyone else.
I see. Well, it's good to see that our staff are contributing at this high level.
Yeah, at the very peak of the question.
Yeah. That's all. So could you tell us a little bit about your thesis work and that experience now that you were an official graduate student?
Jack Roberts basically was an ideal graduate advisor for me because I saw him essentially not at all. And I would do a piece of research, which I was interested in, write a paper, which I was interested in, and give it to him. And he would then return a paper, the draft of paper, so covered in red that I could barely see anything that was there. It was just every semicolon, every comma, every bit of pronunciation was all taken care of. And so he corrected my grammar ruthlessly, and also the storyline. I remember getting back papers, and in which he said, I can't understand why you did any of this. Was there a reason? And the answer to that was, I often thought so, but apparently I wasn't explaining it very clearly. So we went along in this direction for a while, but eventually we reached a sort of stasis in which I understood many of the things that he wanted in a paper. And he, in turn, was willing to give me a free rein in thinking about what I should work on. Mm-hmm. And so I worked on research projects, and I gave him the research projects in the form of drafts of papers. He gave me back the drafts so covered in red ink that I couldn't see what was there, and we went on to the next project. And it worked very well. So the major lesson from that is, for those of you who are thinking about a research director, pick one who doesn't want to be very involved in your research. Mm-hmm. Pick one who is interested enough to know that your name is something or other, but don't try to get involved to the point where you're getting day-by-day comments and corrections. Just go ahead and do your own research.
So how do you think about advising your own students?
I think it works the same way. The major thing that, the major problem I have with students right now is a defect in curiosity. And if you look around the world and you ask questions about how things work, then you should be a scientist, because that's what scientists do. They answer that question. And if you look around the world and you find that you basically don't care what you don't understand, that's okay too. You should work for Goldman Sachs or something of that sort. But it's a difference in point of view. So I'm all for the Caltech approach, which is very strong on, or was very strong, on the issue of the student is the primary initiator of ideas in research, and the research director is there to catch errors and to add improvements and things of that sort, but not to provide the motivation or the problem for the research.
I mean, you've placed students all over the world and in many leadership positions. Are you able to keep up with a lot of them?
The nice thing is you don't need to, because if they're independent, then they go ahead and do whatever they're going to do anyway. And so it's partially economical, and I'm sure this was Jack Roberts' point of view as well, that much of what he did was done because it was the simplest thing to do. He would accept a draft of a paper. There's not much to that. He would do the corrections. My wife, Barbara, who's here somewhere, would say that, over there she is, yes, would say that she can correct a laundry list because she's a professional editor. but Jack could correct a paper, no matter what was in the paper, because he was a professional editor. He just knew how to do this kind of thing. And so, from his point of view, he got drafts. He did what he normally would do anyway, give them back. He would get improved drafts. At some point, it would become something you could submit to a journal, which he would do. And that was the process. Now, that leaves a lot out for what a graduate student should learn how to do, but it's a start.
You talked about not developing a storyline and sort of the communication of scientific ideas. And I know you've been active in that in terms of thinking about how we explain science to the public. Can you talk a little bit about that?
A bit. We went at one point to a conference of a quite different sort. And there was a mixture of people of all different backgrounds who worked on different parts of the problem of writing for the public, or what we'll loosely call the public for the sake of this discussion. And one of the most interesting of the speakers was a woman who wrote medical mysteries. And apparently her thing was the mysteries usually started by someone opening a drawer in a morgue and finding that the person who was there cold stone dead was not actually dead. And the question is, how did they reach to that difficult situation? And what do you do about it? And she went on. But her basic point was that in a scientific paper and in a mystery story and everything else, you have to have the same components. You need to have a problem that needs to be solved. You need to have someone who is a principal solver of the problem. So you need to be able to focus as the reader on what's going on, who's telling you what. You need to be able to explain what the methodology is that you're using so people can judge whether it's realistic or not. And then you need to have an introduction to the class of problems that makes the case that this particular story is not unique to this problem, it's general to a class of problems, and you go on from there. And that's a story, it's a story outline that you can use for almost any paper as far as I can see. So I'm very grateful to her, but I think it's also the case that that is one of the things we should teach students.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And we certainly see in this country now that public appreciation of science is not what it has been. And telling good stories is clearly one way.
You know,
that
when
you
someone
can go.
picks up the paper and they find an article that is full of, forgive me, I know your background, strings and quarks and gluons and whatever, how do I put this politely? The literary rubble that physicists leave in the story when they move on to the next story. It's off-putting. If you don't know what a gluon is, how do you read about articles on gluons? And we need to teach people how to tell good stories.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I won't defend my physics colleagues, don't worry.
But I will remember.
You referred earlier, of course, to coming to California from Boston, the difference you were an undergraduate at Harvard, and then you returned to Harvard in 1982. And what was it like coming back to a place where you had been a student? Was it very different? Was your perspective very different?
Well, your perspective as a teacher was certainly different, because there's a big difference between teaching something and listening to someone who's trying to teach you something which you were generally resisting. So yes, it was something that one paid a lot of attention to. But I think a more general issue was that, you know, a department is a group of people, and the people are trying to solve things that are partially their problem and partially your problem. And if they don't have the your problem in there, you're not interested. And if it's too much of the their problem, you're not interested. So it's part of the story is seeing how they balance that impression, that difference between what can they do with what you were telling them and what can you do with what you're telling yourself and telling them. And from that comes a good research problem. And aside from that, the people almost don't count. I mean, I can be scatological about some of my colleagues, but I'll try not to do that.
We can try to avoid that in this conversation, at least.
Very kind of you.
Yes.
genteel almost.
Yeah. Did you find it hard to establish this kind of collegial relationships because these were your teachers before, or was that just natural because, of course, you had been away for a while?
No, I didn't take very many courses from the faculty there. I mean, I took courses as an undergraduate from them, but I didn't take very many as a graduate student. So I can't comment too much on that.
Yeah. I want to segue now to some of your research, and I described it just a little, of course, but in particular, the work on self-assembled monolayers has really pioneered a number of fields: soft lithography, microcontact printing, nanofabrication, which, of course, this being the 20th anniversary of the KNI is very apt and relevant for what we're talking about. And all of these have had huge industrial impact. Was that in your view when you were making these discoveries?
No. The general idea was that nanotechnology, if you look at a variety of areas of human activity, for example, medicine, you find that cellular biology is full of structures that are interesting and important, do things that we don't understand in terms of catalysis, and they're only a few nanometers apart. And a nanometer, for those of you who may have forgotten, a meter is whatever a meter is, in the order of 3 feet, and a nanometer is in the order of 10 to the minus ninth, 1 billionth of that air size. So that many of the molecules that are inside the cell are in the order of nanometer in size. But perhaps more relevant to most people, their cell phones are full of devices that are made by constructing channels that are effectively wires in them by doing some form of technology, nanolithography, in order to make them. And so I can't look over this audience with the light in my eyes and pick out the ones of you that use cell phones, but I'll suspect it's a fairly large number, all things considered. And so the question then is the question of, if the world of commercial development and the world of biology and a number of things in material science are as important as they seem to be, shouldn't every field be able to work in these areas? And the answer, I think, is yes. So what is the way that one makes nanotechnology available to the public in general? And the answer is by probably developing techniques. So what we were interested in doing in self-assembly and self-assembled monolayers was to develop techniques that made it possible for people who were not specialists in nanotechnology, nonetheless, to make nanostructures. And it's been very successful in that, because you can, all of you who are so inclined to do something of this sort, can make a 50 nanometer wire on the top of your stove in about 5 minutes if you put your mind to it. It's very straightforward stuff to do. So that initial phase of things, what makes it simple to get into working in this area, is now taken care of. I think what one has to do at this point is to take care of the second part, which you sort of slithered over, which is that it hasn't revolutionized the economics of baking things, and that still has to be worked on. But I think it used to be the case that physics had a component of people who spent a lot of time and effort building machines or making machines work that were for nanoscale fabrication and measurement and things of that sort. And now a lot of that work has gone away because it's just much simpler to make the things that you're looking at exploring first by trying them, making them and trying them, and making them as easy to do at this stage. So that's simplicity.
And we return. There is a herd mentality right now in science. I don't know, from my point of view, it's gotten worse. rather than better. And you've talked about the opposite, counterpopulism, I think is the term that you've used. And can you talk a little bit about how that's guided your approach to picking problems?
Yes, although it's a complicated and in some areas contentious subject. Why do people become scientists? Part of the reason is that they love doing science and finding out how things work. But part of the reason is it's a field where you can be very competitive and see what's going on. So when you work in a field that someone else has also identified as being important, you're competing. You may or may not like doing that. I prefer to have an objective that I don't have to compete to achieve. And then the other question is something which has been pointed out to me by a number of other workers in this area at the interface between science and technology, which is that when you work on something that other people are working on, they get there first, then forever after you work for them because you're following. And the alternative is if you're working on something where there's a competitor and you get there first, they're working for you for the rest of eternity. And it's an easier way of doing things because you can then go and do the experiments that are over there to see if there's something that you hadn't expected in that direction. It's much harder if you've got someone who's breathing down your neck doing standard stuff. So it's basically more fun and easier to work in an area in which you don't have competition, which means that you want to work in a field that has the characteristic that there aren't that many other people doing the same thing you're trying to do. Preferably, there's anyone trying to do what you're trying to do. And that's the reason for working on areas that don't involve large numbers of people with established laboratories and Bell Labs sitting there looking at your toenails and so on.
And as you know, I was at Bell Labs for a while, but I'll avoid that conversation as well.
But look where it's led you.
Yeah.
I mean, you could be doing real science.
Yeah, well, maybe that's why I came to Caltech.
Yeah.
So I agree. If you can if you can define an area for yourself and explore it and experiment, there's a freedom in that that's remarkable. But how do you get the support to do that then?
Thank you, Kavli. I mean, one way in which you get the support is you get people who have money to want to give you money because it's partially their job and partially it's something that they think is a worthwhile thing to do. And we have somewhere in the audience Cindy Friend, who presently is a very important figure in the Kavli Foundation. And she understands the intrinsic interest in doing fundamental research, by which I mean research that's directed toward understanding why something is going on rather than understanding the applications of something that's going on. But not everyone does, and one reason why Caltech could be so important, as we discussed, is that what this field needs, among other things, is people who can tell stories about what science is, what science does, how it's done, and why it's important in a way that people can understand. Is this more or less important than TikTok? I won't comment on that because I don't know your taste in TikTok and related things. But my guess is you would say
guess.
I can guess
So, yeah.
that you might pick something else as being more important than TikTok. I certainly would. One of my ambitions in life is to look at TikTok at some point, and I haven't so far.
Well, I'm glad that you're finding other pursuits, actually.
Well, one does the best one can with limited resources.
So, so you were talking, or at least around the issue of curiosity-driven research versus problem-driven science. And can you talk about this distinction and how it's entered in your own career?
Yes. And I will do this by making a simple account of something which many of you who are faculty members have experienced in one or another fashion. You open your mail or look at your email and you get an account, a letter from typically a person who invites you on behalf of the students at X, where X is a place you've heard of, to come and give a lecture. This is a student-invited lecture. And the immediate response to this is, give me a break, I've got a billion things to do with my life, and why should I go to wherever it is, charging through feet of snow in Angry Buffalo in order to give a lecture there? But you get over this. Having said that, it's still a horrifying experience to say that it's 6:30 in the evening and you've just walked into what looks like a cheap restaurant somewhere, and in front of you is a room with a long table sitting in, which will hold, we'll say, 12 people. And the 12 people filter in, and they're faculty who really didn't want you to come in the first place. And then you've come, and they would like to be entertained by what you have to say, so there's entertainment that's a key part of it. And the entire process is one which is designed, I think, by approved evolutionary methods to make your life as miserable as possible. And that's okay, I understand that, I would do the same thing. But the question is, what does one do in response? And what I do in response is to go with a standard question, which I'd like to have the answer to. It isn't totally blind, but I would like them to tell me the answer to something, if they're as good as they think they are, the answer to something that's as good as it can be from people who are experts. And an example is that if you have a piece of wire, it's copper wire that's this long, and you run a current through it, it generates a magnetic field. And the magnetic field is not only there, but it's circular around or helical around the wire. The question is, why does moving electrons or charge make any difference? And that's, a good opening question. Essentially, no one has ever been able to answer that, other than to say that it falls naturally out of special relativity. And all you have to do is read Feynman's books, which is like saying that you read the Old Testament and memorize it word for word, and you'll know something about Christianity. And that's undoubtedly true, but it's not something which most of us have the time to do. But when you go through this process, and after a while, you do get bits and snatches of really very interesting views of how things work, which one can apply in different directions. So the question of understanding where ideas come from is partially you, but it's partially understanding that if out of a group of 15 distinguished academics, not one can tell you where magnetism comes from. There might be something interesting in magnetism to look at, since basically everything that we work in the world, motors and cars and buses and airplanes, whatever, relies on magnetism. It's moving electrons through wires. So there are lots of ways of skinning this particular rabbit. And the key thing is to understand that what you want is something which has the characteristic that you and the audience agree that there's a problem to be solved. And the problem, ideally, I think, should be a big problem. And then, having determined that it's a big problem, it should be one in which you can find some sort of mechanism for proceeding from there to a simple new approach, where the simple new approach makes it possible for people to do experiments that they couldn't do before. And then if you do that, work successfully, then evidently from understanding the new technology, the new science, you will be able to develop new technology which answers important problems. But the first thing is you have to know what you're talking about. And knowing what you're talking about depends in a crucial part on understanding what you're talking about. And there are probably many ways of getting at that problem, but I've mentioned one, which is a little bit less obvious, or was less obvious to us when we started using it.
Yeah, thank you. A somewhat dystopian view of getting to actually a utopian answer, I think.
I think it's a utopian view because you think that there is an answer somewhere.
Yeah, no. I was
dystopian
thinking
view
of
would be
the
to say
12
that, we're
people
working in a
around
world
the
which
table.
operates on the basis of Maxwell's
Yeah,
equations.
no, I agree. It is utopian in that sense. Yeah, no, you got there. I agree. I refer to my debt to you in terms of the molecular engineering effort at University of Chicago. I want to step back a little, though, and ask you how you're thinking about the direction of engineering these days, and what's working, what isn't, where could the field be going?
An answer to that very interesting question is to look at what engineers do. And what we hear about in the news now is not so much people building bridges over rivers, you hear some of that, but you hear about the conflicts between the United States and China. And so China desperately needs, for a variety of reasons, independent sources to pay for the immense costs of developing processes that make nanostructures, particularly electronically active nanostructures. And one way they can do that is to make weapons. Now, one way we can prevent them from using the weapons is to make better nanostructures, which will go into better things for better purposes. It's all very complicated, and there's an issue there, which is a good one for the younger people in the audience to think about. But that question of understanding what the applications are of what you're going to do, and is it really important or is it not really important, is, I think, a crucial issue for everyone to pay attention to. Now, magnetism, I guarantee, for those of you who are interested in it, is important. And the question of what's the best way of developing a firm enough view of magnetism that you can go ahead and use things is up to you. One of the problems with the approach that I've determined, which is to try to showcase the areas that you think are interesting and important to people who have money who think it might be interesting and important, is that they may disagree with you. And in that case, you've got a problem. And maybe working for Goldman Sachs is the right answer to that particular problem. Maybe staying with science is not. But science is basically, I think, a lot more fun than working with Goldman Sachs. So the issue for everyone who's thinking about being a technologist is, how do you put together all the pieces that you need? And the pieces are graduate students who have the right kind of background, graduate students who are interested in science from the point of view of understanding an important problem that will benefit from having what you discover converted into an answer to a problem. And all of this at a price that someone can afford, and a lifespan or a span for the project that is compatible with your provincial, your own lifespan. And if your lifespan, your prospective lifespan, is very short, and it's going to be a very expensive project, and once you've got it, it's going to cost other people staggering amounts of money to implement your solution, you should probably pick something else.
So we were talking earlier about your experience with DARPA and how it has been influential in terms of picking problems and interacting with people and the opportunities it affords young scientists. Could you talk a little bit about the state of the world in that sense and those kinds of opportunities?
Well, I've done a lot of work over the course of time with DARPA, and I've actively enjoyed working with DARPA for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons was that for a number of years, they sponsored a group called the Research DARPA. I don't have one on my appropriate sweater, but anyway, it's the Defense Research Projects Agency. And they sponsored a group of academic scientists who would get together, typically young people, and talk to one another about what the connection was between the atoms that you put into a new solid and the properties of that new solid and what you might do with it. So an example of a problem is that for a number of years, it was the case that people would build rocket engines, and the rocket engines would have throat nozzles on them, that is, areas at the bottom through which the hot gases emerged. And those hot gases would often lead to erosion of the throat nozzle. So what would happen is the rocket would get up in the air, it would burn a hole in the throat nozzle, the thing would flip over and crash into the ground, and that would cost, pick a number, $15 billion, something like that, staggering quantities of number. My son, where's George? Here's George. He's also a George Whitesides, and he knows far more about this than I do, so I'm repeating only what I've been told by people who are experts, and he may have different opinions. But the underlying approach to all of this kind of thing is to understand what makes a good throat nozzle, what makes it possible to stand up to a stream of erosive gas that's trying to etch away your being, just as you're doing it. And that led to the creation of a field called material science. What's interesting about material science to me is it's a thriving discipline in the United States. It's one of the things we do, I think, in general pretty well. But it was actually a field created by the military to solve a particular problem or a particular class of problems in making devices that were intended to be used in very difficult circumstances, which is space launch, obviously, but in field operations and in long periods of time for shooting howitzer shells and stuff like this. It's not that I disapprove of the military applications, we just don't work on them. But the basic idea of understanding the relation between a solid and the structure of that solid and the properties of that solid is an intensely interesting for chemistry and also condensed matter physics. And so that's the answer to the question. What one does is basically to try to find something in which underlying something which you know to be important is a deep area of understanding in which you really don't know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And that gives you something to go to work on. Yeah. And I would argue with you that if you do that, you go to work on these areas that are understood, but not clearly enough understood that they can be used in a directive sense, you will always succeed. Mm-hmm. Because there's so much of the world that we live in that is populated by phenomena that are just not clear as we do it. So all of those are research problems, and they can be problems that can be employers of large numbers of people that can make better sewer systems that now can, at least we hope, contribute to climate change and to water availability and to things of this sort. The world is not short on problems. It is short on solutions. And solutions often depend upon understanding the science that underlies a given area. So for those of you who are interested, there's no shortage of problems. Just stay away from problems that other people have already, I'll say very politely, been involved in.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. And I think you have an audience that is situated to do something about that advice. Thank you, George, for that. We have some questions. Tiffany Komodo, who has helped organize this, was kind enough to print them out. So these are questions that we received from you earlier. What do you think is the singular most consequential technology on the horizon, and what does science and society need to consider? A rather broad question. Yeah.
Yes, a rather broad question. Well, I've just mentioned three. One is, what do we do about climate change?
Yeah.
The second is, what do we do to provide energy and to store it? Storing it is probably more important than providing it. And then the third is, what do we do with new technologies like artificial intelligence? Are they important? Should we work on them hard? Should we let somebody else pay for development work and then we dip in later? I mean, those are all, I think, wonderful questions. And those three are all undisputably important questions. And they may be important in ways that people don't understand. So, for example, in understanding energy, what one does basically is to take electrons, let's put it in that direction, electrons running through a wire, and instead you stuff them as excess electrons in a solid, the battery material, in such a fashion that they can be recovered and run something else other than running through the wire. And that's easy to say, and it turns out to be actually quite difficult to do in large scale. So, one of the ideas is to look at Maxwell's equations. You look at Maxwell's equations, and thank you very much for teaching us Maxwell's equations in physics 1. And what you find is that Maxwell's equations, which describe the interaction between electric fields and magnetic fields, doesn't fundamentally care whether the charged particle that's moving is an electron or an ion. And if it's an ion, you're talking about a battery. And if it's an electron, you're talking about a motor, or you're talking about something else of that sort. So there's lots of opportunities for crossover there. But the underlying idea is that if you pick the problem and the problem is the right one, then the answer that you come up with, assuming you can solve the problem, that's up to you, is that you will be able to find solutions for it, you'll be able to find applications for it in a wide variety of different areas, some of which may not have been the ones that you started on at the very beginning. So problem choice is critically important, and problem choice, in my view, is staying away from what other people are doing. Other people may have different strategies for doing that, and you can go from there.
Very good, thank you. What excites you most about the future applications of microfluidics, and what will it take to see this future?
Well, there are a lot of people beginning to work on this. The applications of microfluidics, first let's explain what it is. If you make channels that are a few microns in diameter, the width of a hair in diameter, you begin to approach the size of the capillaries that are involved in tissue. And so these capillaries carry the blood flows through them, that provides the nutrients and the oxygen to the tissue, and the tissue includes, for example, the brain if you're interested in Alzheimer's disease, or it includes the kidneys if you're interested in some areas of congestive heart failure and kidney failure. And the question then is to understand what the relationship is between the flow of fluids in capillaries and the flow of fluids in Hoover Dam. And you say, well, those are totally different. Well, in some ways they're totally different, and in some ways they're not. They're both fluids flowing. So what are the similarities? And the question of what are the similarities and what are the commonalities is the thing that physics is particularly good at answering. It looks for those kinds of similarities. But, if you ask now what's going on, all sorts of people are using techniques primarily based on soft lithography, making microcapillary systems through which they flow fluids that are not designed to be blood, but like blood, through cells that have attached to the inside of the capillary, to understand what the relationship is between the temperature, the oxygen concentration, the fluid flow, all the rest of those kinds of questions, and the behaviors of the cells. And it's actually a very interesting area, because what you've done is something that science typically does, which is to take a problem that looks intractably complex and then fish out of it parts that are probably attackable by isolation, intellectual isolation, and can be looked at in those terms. And that's an example of how one goes about using that kind of thing.
And then how do you put those pieces back together?
Yeah, in some cases it's done relatively empirically. That is to say, you give a new drug to a patient. The patient might get better, but you give the new drug to another patient, might not get better. Or even more peculiar, you give the drug to a patient who has what seems to be a different disease, and they get better. And what do you do about that? Well, you celebrate chance being on your side. And I think that happens in a lot of these things. What one does is to construct new knowledge. The new knowledge is used to make ideas for how you would apply the knowledge, and the applied version of new knowledge to an established problem is technology. And so one can make a pathway there from science to technology. And there's a lot of that that's done.
So the last question I have for you is, if you could go back in time and give yourself advice at the start of your career, what would you tell your past self?
I don't think it would be enormously different from what's actually happened. The crucial thing I would say to myself is don't deviate from the business of not working what other people have worked on. Because if you solve a problem that somebody has solved before you, then it doesn't help you in the next round of raising money. It doesn't help you with all sorts of things. But if you do it yourself and you do it by yourself, you can be proud of what you've done. And your equivalent of a statue with a sword overhead is, in fact, a paper in Phys Rev Letters or Journal of the American Chemical Society or something of that sort. And then there's another class of problems, which is how do you get people to read your solution, to use your method, and to do things with it. And that we don't have the time to discuss that here because that's politically complicated as well. But the basic underlying ideas are that you take your ideas, try to find applications which illustrate to people what can be done, and put together a package that consists over the course of probably several years of the new understanding and the applications of the new understanding, or model applications of the new understanding, and hope that what that leads to is sufficient interest in the part of the observer that they try those ideas and it works for what they're interested in. And then if enough people are interested in something, then there's a very interesting self-assembling, self-amplifying process that occurs in which the people who are interested in the subject start having conferences and talking to one another and collaborating. And that can often lead to very rapid expansion of new knowledge.
And you've traversed the basic scientific obstacles towards the technology, which has really been characteristic of your career. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you.